the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She completed her BA in History and Literature at the University of Pittsburgh and her MA in European History at the University of Houston. Her dissertation project examines the SS Lebensborn program and its effect on post-war Norwegian society and memory culture. She is particularly concerned with the interaction of gender with memory and with the concepts of resistance and collaboration. Her research has been supported by German and American foundations, and she has already published some of her results in English, I guess, yes. In an edited volume called German Occupied Europe in the Second World War. So, please go ahead.
I always like to start these with just sort of a blanket statement. I'm using the sort of terminology of my historical actors, so anytime you hear, genetically valuable or area, those aren't my feelings, those are just, what I've got to work with. So, all right. When the German army conquered Norway in spring 1940, they found themselves masters of a strategically vital and genetically desirable country. Unlike on the Eastern Front, in highly Aryan Norway, the occupiers had little opportunity to commit the crime of Rassenschande, usually translated as race defilement or defiling race. On the contrary, German soldiers in Norway operated under express orders to treat the Norwegian population with respect and to be friendly to the women in particular. The occupation force enthusiastically embraced its license to engage in romantic relationships with female Norwegians, both in and out of wedlock, knowing that such relationships would likely be sanctioned, if not encouraged, by the Nazi leadership. This perception was bolstered by several high-ranking German officials' outspoken and relatively early willingness to allow marriages between German soldiers and Norwegian women. In addition, within a year of the occupation, SS head Heinrich Himmler and the German occupation authorities decided to implement the Lebensborn program in Norway in order to help care for the more than 1,000 children expected by Norwegian mothers in 1941. By the end of the war, between 10 and 12,000 children were fathered by Germans stationed in Norway, 8,000 of them with the official assistance of the SS Lebensborn organization. These German-Norwegian Kriegsbarne, or war children, elicited the highest concern and most privileged care from Nazi officials throughout the war. Liberation in May 1945, however, heralded the beginning of a new phase, one marked by enmity and often abuse in the lives of the Lebensborn children. These children and their mothers were now almost universally reviled in their home country, where once they had exemplified national belonging, albeit as defined by Nazi ideology, the Lebensborn children now constituted both a perceived threat and a shameful stain to the Norwegian nation that had suffered at the hands of the Germans, as well as a distasteful reminder of individual Norwegians' varying degrees of collaboration. From the immediate post-war period until the mid-1950s, therefore, the Norwegian Lebensborn children's and mothers' lives were marked heavily by governmental debates, official efforts to deport, imprison, or strip the Lebensborn participants of Norwegian citizenship, sometimes intense interpersonal violence during the liberation, and verbal and physical bullying during the Lebensborn children's primary school years. During this period, stigmatizing these perceived traitors allowed the rest of the country to feel purged of collaborators and to consolidate a national identity as resistors. Drawing upon the work of French historian Fabrice Vigil and many others, my paper interrogates women's bodies and sexuality as expressions of nation and ideological identity in order to help determine just how collaboration became coded as female and resistance conversely as male in the occupied and post-war Norwegian context. Further, this paper concentrates on the German-Norwegian war children, considering the various identities imposed on them and abuses suffered by them to be largely the result of their mother's sexual behavior. As we shall see, Norwegians ascribed a wide variety of negative traits to these children, believing that the same distasteful actions and attitudes exhibited by their mothers would be passed on in the womb. Inextricably bound up with these concepts are memory and narrative. My paper aims to demonstrate how the Norwegian Lebensborn mothers and their children were punished and excluded both from Norwegian society and public discourse during and after the war. In contrast to the treatment of these feminized and marginalized groups, prominent and generally male economic and military collaborators were largely rehabilitated into the national body, eventually, as we see it took some time. Ultimately, I argue that silencing the Norwegian Lebensborn mothers and their children allowed the Norwegian people collectively to emphasize their country's martial masculine resistance to the Nazis, and concurrently code collaboration as a predominantly female enterprise. Norwegians discussed with the 10 to 12,000 so-called Tyskungen, or German brats maybe is the best translation, born to Norwegian mothers took many forms. During the post-war era, any one of the 8,000 Lebensborn children might have simultaneously experienced governmental discrimination, direct interpersonal violence, misinformation regarding their origin, and a host of other disadvantages and punishments. Most significantly, this abuse took place within the repressive environment that marked the post-war Norwegian public sphere. After the violent frenzy of the liberation and the highly public, hotly debated governmental initiatives to solve Norway's Lebensborn problem during the period from 1940 to the mid-1950s, the Lebensborn children's adolescence and early adulthood were conversely marked by inattention and silence. Having been saddled with a host of unwanted labels and denied the one identity that might have afforded them protection from their neighbors, that of Norwegian citizenship, shortly after the war, their opportunities to achieve the understanding or sympathy of their would-be countrymen was severely curtailed in the following decades by the taboo of discussing their mother's wartime behavior. Instead, their mothers and their own experiences were silenced and suppressed during these years of the Lebensborn children's lives. Violence against the Norwegian Lebensborn children and their mothers began immediately after the war ended. The arrests, head shavings, and beatings visited upon the so-called Tysktusser, German tarts or whores, depending on what you like, during the frenzied days of the liberation underscore the severity of the perceived betrayal these Norwegian women had committed. The Norwegian women who had sexual relations with Germans had led privileged existences during the war, especially if they became pregnant and delivered their children through Lebensborn, availing themselves of the remarkable nutritional resources provided there and sparking feelings of envy and anger among the broader Norwegian population. Although the women's horizontal collaboration did not violate any official law, and in the face of the political and economic collaboration of tens of thousands of other Norwegians, the Tysktusser were the only Norwegians who lost their citizenship as a consequence of their connection to the Germans. Just as the Lebensborn mothers had supposedly committed treason through their sexual activity, their children became regarded as a potential fifth column within Norway by virtue of their birth. Their half-German blood, it was thought, might predispose them to treason and fascism. Utilizing much of the same popular eugenics-based reasoning drawn upon by the Third Reich in justifying the Holocaust, several Norwegian medical experts proclaimed the biological unfitness and deficiency of the Lebensborn children. The broader public shared these anxieties, and many Norwegians did not hesitate to express their thoughts on the matter. In a May 1945 editorial in the Lofoten, a daily newspaper from the north of the country, the author asserted, quote, "They are unable to become Norwegians. Their fathers were Germans, their mothers were Germans in thought and action. They will forever constitute an element of irritation and unrest among the pure Norwegian population." Unquote. Although a few isolated, although a few isolated voices raised objections, the vast majority of the Norwegian populace felt that deporting the Lebensborn children and their mothers to Germany would cleanse their country of the shameful taint of collaboration and resolve the potential national security issue posed by the Lebensborn children's half-German genetics. Norwegian government officials subscribed to similar ideas and began considering plans to deport the Kriegsbarne to Germany even before the war had ended. As early as autumn 1943, exiled Norwegian politicians in Stockholm arrived at a proposal for deportation, which included the creation of a supervisory agency with the power to separate mother and child for national reasons. These plans reached the exiled Norwegian government in London in March 1944, which established an official committee with the sole purpose of determining whether or not this deportation should be undertaken. Norwegian officials proceeded purportedly with the best intentions of the Lebensborn children in mind. Away from the prying eyes and harsh judgments of local Norwegian communities, they claimed, the children could begin their lives anew, free from the Lebensborn stigma, potentially even with their German fathers and extended paternal families. Norwegian officials even appointed the War Child Commission on July 3, 1945, in order to ensure that the interests of the Kriegsbarne were served by the government. The commission consisted of a number of high-ranking authorities, both civil and professional, charged with, quote, recommending whether it was desirable to deport mothers and children to Germany, what legal adjustments would be needed, and also what initiatives should be implemented if they were to remain in Norway, unquote. The Norwegian government abandoned its tentative plans to deport the Lebensborn participants to Germany after an international conference on war children held in Zurich in September 1945 addressed the dire post-war circumstances in Norway. The Norwegian representative to this conference, the physician Else Tingstad, noted the basic lack of necessities in Germany, as well as the embittered, unwelcoming attitude of German society, and concluded that Germany could not provide any semblance of normalcy or comfort to the Lebensborn children's upbringing. An alternative location would have to be found. Earlier that year, on July 23, 1945, the Norwegian social minister Sven Oftedal had traveled to Stockholm with the hope of arranging for some of Norway's war children to be sent there. This attempt was unsuccessful. Only 30 Norwegian Krigsbarn ever arrived in Sweden through official governmental channels. The most remarkable effort centered on the proposed deportation of 9,000 Norwegian war children to Australia. Senior officials from Australia and Norway met in Oslo November 22nd and 23rd, 1945, and reached an agreement to this effect. The transportation of such large numbers of people proved to be unfeasible, however, and plans were delayed until late 1946, when it was decided that because most of the 9,000 children had already been adopted, deporting the war children to Australia would do more harm than good. The Norwegian government now had little choice but to care for its war children itself. The question of the proper citizenship status for the Lebensborn children and their mothers proved highly difficult for Norwegian officials. Professional and popular opinion directly after the war challenged the Norwegianness of the war children, as we've seen. Born to an enemy father and a morally loose traitor mother, it was thought that the Lebensborn children could scarcely ever hope to become good, upstanding Norwegian citizens. Due to these anxieties, the children remained an ambiguous legal category until 1950. During the controversy over repatriation, the Norwegian government began using the term children of Norwegian extraction or partially Norwegian extraction to describe the hundreds of returning Krigsbarn. The Definitive Citizenship Act of 1950 closed the matter for good. The mothers of half-German children could reacquire their citizenship upon application after a period of 5 years. The children themselves, however, could not apply for citizenship until they had reached 18 years of age. At its most extreme then, the policy meant that a child conceived near the end of occupation could not become a full legal Norwegian citizen until 1964. In light of the overwhelmingly negative tide of public opinion and the fact that the Lebensborn children could not be deported from Norway, the War Children Commission proposed that the government undertake a public education campaign to incite more sympathetic feelings towards the Krigsbarn. The Commission also recommended the expansion of child welfare services in Norway, as well as the prioritization of Lebensborn mothers' educations. On a less savory note, in October 1945, the Commission also proposed measures to give the government absolute control over the war children, even against the express wishes of their mothers. A child could be placed in foster care, be deported, or even have his or her name changed under the conditions of these draft bills. The Norwegian government never implemented such dubious measures. Just as all the Commission's recommendations were set to be sent to the Norwegian Parliament, the sudden opportunity to deport the war children to Australia appeared to obviate the necessity for such programs. By the time the Australian deportation option fell through in 1946, the war children had already been individually adopted and reabsorbed into Norwegian society to such an extent that the measures proposed by the Commission would likely have had little impact. Of course, not all war children had equal fortune in their attempted assimilation. One of the most notable examples of the Commission's and the Norwegian government's failure to adequately anticipate and provide for the needs of the Krigsbarn may be found in the story of the largest post-war repository of unclaimed Lebensborn children, the orphanage at Gotthold. The orphanage had operated as an official Lebensborn home during the war, but needed Norwegian staff and financial assistance to care for the children once the Germans had left. Despite repeated pleas for financial assistance from local Red Cross organizations, the Ministry of Social Affairs refused to act for months. By the spring of 1946, almost all of the war children had been moved from the home, though 27 Lebensborn children still remained at Gotthold, all of whom had been labeled mentally retarded, presumably because they had not been educated and increasingly poorly cared for after the war's end. Because the Ministry of Social Affairs found it nearly impossible to find parents willing to adopt or orphanages willing to shelter these children, officials hit upon the idea of sending the children to an internment camp for women who had slept with German soldiers. The camp shut down before any arrangements could be made, however, which left Norwegian authorities with just one perceived viable solution based on the children's supposed developmental shortcomings: to place the Gotthold children in institutions for the mentally retarded and disturbed. The children had never been tested for so-called mental retardation and did not receive the opportunity either to challenge this classification or to undertake any education or training programs. This example of negligence on the part of the Norwegian government represents at once an extreme and also the norm of official attitude towards the Krigsbarna. While the vast majority of Lebensborn children did not have to contend with institutionalization, they nevertheless experienced the negative effects of the Norwegian authorities' indifference to their standard of living. Such near-total lack of concern accelerated about a year after the liberation. Authorities simply assumed that after the vengeful spirit of liberation had died down, the Lebensborn children and their mothers would be unobtrusively reabsorbed into Norwegian society. And to a certain extent, this expectation proved correct, though the social acceptance of the Krigsbarna was never complete and always bore the scars of individuals' lifetime experiences and wartime experiences. Norwegian officials and private individuals did indeed find places for the Lebensborn children with their mothers, their extended relations, adoptive families, or in foster homes, orphanages, or institutions for the mentally deficient. Further, the Norwegian government believed that the reassimilation conveyed by these superficial statistics implied success in solving the war children problem. This mistaken perception, however, led officials to abandon measures such as the public opinion campaign and educational initiatives meant to facilitate Lebensborn participants' full re-entry into Norwegian life. Instead, the government adopted a policy of silence and non-interference to the everyday obstacles faced by the war children and their mothers. Ignoring many Norwegians' openly hateful attitude towards the Krigsbarna only exacerbated the daily suffering these children experienced in the first post-war decades. Many Lebensborn children had violent and traumatic crimes perpetrated against them. The liberation's spirit of vengeance and retaliation, which Norwegian authorities had hoped would simply dissipate, sparked rabid anti-German sentiment among many Norwegians in the first decades following the war. The unprotected status of the Lebensborn children and their high visibility in Norwegian communities made them ideal targets for the supposedly righteous anger. Playground bullying, sexual assault and rape, verbal and physical abuse, social ostracism, and even branding and torture at the hands of their neighbors, foster, step, or birth parents marked many Norwegian Lebensborn children's early years and adolescence. The disturbing prevalence of sexual attacks committed against both boys and girls in particular may indicate the perpetrator's psychological motivations for the violence stemmed from the original acts of sexual collaboration committed by the Lebensborn mothers. A sort of symbolic revenge. In addition, many Lebensborn children recall having feelings of deep shame about their existence, even when their parentage had been kept a secret from them. Indeed, silence characterized the vast majority of Lebensborn children's early lives. The subject of their parentage remained taboo, sometimes until the deaths of their adoptive parents. The children who knew their origins could often not talk about them with anyone, and the children who did not understand the source of their instinctive shame could not prepare themselves for confrontations with schoolyard bullies or ill-meaning neighbors. While there were exceptions to this rule, more often than not, the Lebensborn mothers and children ended up mutually blaming one another for the misfortunes that blighted their lives. With respect to their other familial relationships, both biological and adoptive, the Lebensborn children recount feeling plagued by a sense of never truly belonging or feeling accepted. Many of these children found loving homes with supportive families, though these accounts are currently underrepresented. However, local Norwegian community dynamics usually ensured that even these Lebensborn children felt the full weight of the inferiority ascribed to them. The deep and lasting wounds carried by the Lebensborn children into their adult years reveal themselves in statistical analyses of their lives. Dag Eddingson's comparative study of 1,150 war children in 2004 points out several trends. On the one hand, nearly 90% of these war children have been married at some point. Additionally, they own houses and have children of their own and would seem to embody the very, quote, picture of normality. On the other hand, however, war children have a much higher rate of suicide than their peers. They experience more health problems, particularly mental health problems. They have more divorces, and they achieve much lower levels of education and income. For example, Ellingson's study could not locate a single war child who went on to earn a PhD. The trauma, instability, and isolation of their childhood continue to adversely impact them even today. In conclusion, in the wake of their traumatic Nazi occupation, Norwegians collectively sought to make sense of their wartime experiences by scapegoating certain prominent traitors like Quisling and anybody who ended up on the execution block, as well as the feminized groups of German Norwegian war children and their mothers. While these groups did not face a firing squad, they were victim to a host of other punishments that, in questioning their very ability to be real Norwegians, excluded them and their experiences from the post-war national conversation and body politic. This silencing and ostracizing of such problematic individuals allowed a much clearer path to consolidating the nation of resistors myth that held such sway in Norway and abroad in the immediate post-war years. It also, however, had adverse and lasting effects in the extreme for the children and mothers in question, which the Norwegian government and public have only in very recent decades begun to confront. These pictures, there's actually apparently an app you can buy. It's a game, and I think it's meant to be an educational game. I think it's called My Child Lebensborn or something like that. It's meant to be educational about what these children went through. So rather than look up pictures of child abuse, I thought I would give you the cartoons instead.
Thank you very much, Pauline. That is a very interesting paper on a horrible legacy of the war. From Norway, we now turn to Ukraine. Our next speaker is Marta Havrishko. She is currently a research fellow at the Department of Contemporary History at the Ivan Krypakiewicz Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the Ukrainian National Academy of Sciences. Marta has received several international fellowships to do research in Australia, Germany, and Poland. In addition, her research was supported by Canadian, Swiss, and French institutions. Currently, she is conducting a study on sexual violence against Jewish women during the Holocaust in Ukraine, and her former project was a gender history of the Ukrainian nationalist underground. And I think it's this study where your presentation today comes from. And you have published a book on this and several articles.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here. Today I will talk about Ukraine Nationalist Underground Movement and its military wing, Ukraine Insurgent Army, OUN and UPA, and about its legacy, and specifically I will talk about gender dimensions of OUN and UPA history. So the history and legacy of OUN and UPA, the largest anti-communist movement in the territory of Soviet Union, are becoming the core of the Ukraine national historical narrative, framing the official memory politics in present Ukraine. Those who are interested in Ukraine maybe know about these several laws established in 3 years ago. 4 laws, we call them decommunization laws, and according to those laws, members of the underground movement are perceived as fighters for Ukraine independence. So they perceived as heroes. And such a narrative is remarkable for the glorification of nationalist movement in general and the heroization of OUN leaders and UPA commanders, whose official portrayal appears to be immune to any critical inquiry. Historians working for the state-sponsored institutions are trying to avoid to bring to light unpleasant, shameful, and even criminal aspects of OUN and UPA history. And the study of women's experience and gender dimensions of OUN and UPA history in general undermines this idealistic perception of Ukraine insurgents, UPA and OUN members, freedom fighters in Ukraine, and opens a wider discussion in Ukraine. Today I will concentrate on their ideas about sexuality, about women's body in nationalist discourse, and how these ideas were turned to gender-based violence against women, both groups of women. I mean those who were the members of OUN and UPA movement, as well as, let's say, civilian women. And I want to say a couple of words about gender regime in Ukraine underground movement. Thousands of women joined OUN and UPA during and after World War II, motivated by love, hate, patriotism, fear, or opportunity. Engagement to the underground activity provided them with emancipation from their relatives, some access to education and power, of course limited and lasted only for the duration of women's participation in the resistance movement. Mass mobilization of women to Ukraine underground struggle in the early 1940s was caused by the changing circumstances of war. Most of women could live legally or semi-legally in the village, and they have, let's say, more peaceful appearance than men. So they could perform duties which cannot be performed by men. For example, in the intelligence, carry weapons, delivering medicines, and so on and so on. And due to patriarchal use of the woman leadership, on the normative gender division of labor, a vast majority of female members of the underground did combat support roles, which were associated with traditional women's work, such as cooking, washing, cleaning, and emotional support of insurgents. Majority of women of the underground served as the nurses. They organized and headed medical service of Ukraine Red Cross. Women were also actively engaged in propaganda activities. Here you see some journals and other publications of Ukraine underground. After special training courses, many women were assigned the technical functions of copy editing, retyping, and dissemination of these materials. Only a few women contributed as authors and served as editors for underground periodical literature. For example, Lyudmila Foya, a double agent. First of all, she was Soviet agent, and then she was a member of the underground movement and intelligence worker, and also very famous author in underground. And she committed suicide in 1940 in order to avoid capture by Soviets. There were several orders and instructions which restricted women from military service and combat roles in UPA. Women never became commanders of UPA military units. Some commanders expelled women from their armed groups due to beliefs that women undermine military brotherhood, effectiveness of insurgents activities, and make men more emotional and less violent. But despite existed restrictions, what circumstances create opportunities for women to transgress gender boundaries and perform some masculine roles in the guerrilla. And many women were engaged in violent practices of UPA, I mean terrorist attacks and also ethnic cleansing against Poles, especially in Volhynia and Eastern Galicia. And also they were also agents of violence against Ukrainian civilians in the Western Ukraine. And we have a lot of pictures of women in uniforms with carry weapon, so they have very military look. And for example, one of the famous Ukrainian women in Ukraine underground, Artemisia Halicka-Motrya, she was captured by Soviets in December 1944, and here you see a quote from NKVD report, in this report he indicated how Motrya engaged in violent practices against locals. For example, in December of 1944, Motrya with 7 partisans held a campaign to liquidate the head of cooperative in the village of Samushin. They strangled, shot, and threw him for the bridge of the Dniester River. Here you see another woman, Odarka, Stefania Punich. Yes, she was also sentenced to Gulag, 10 years in Gulag, and she also was very active in violent practices of Ukraine underground movement in Bukovina. It's a western part of Ukraine, one of the western parts. And there is a myth, very popular in nationalist discourse, that most of women were led by patriotic feelings and so on and so on, and that's why they perform those violent practices. But we have several cases of women like Halina Sichkaruk, She was a teacher and she was forced to perform terrorist act against NKVD officer. And here you see this obligation. I have to complete the task below, which I have been entrusted with from the UPA. Should the NKVD chief of the Kupichev area, in case I fail this task, I and my family will send trial of the UPA, it means killing. So it was choiceless choice. But when we talk about specificity of women's experience of underground, we should first of all be considered in the context of body, sexuality and reproductive behavior. War intensified the patriarchal discourse relating to women's sexuality and sexual behavior. In the center of Ukraine nationalist discourse of female sexuality, there are notions of motherhood, purity, loyalty, modesty and virginity. Following the logic, the perfect sexuality of a woman was presented as a passive one, subordinated to an active man. Social approval was given only to a reproductive-oriented sexual behavior, and the heterosexual family was considered as its only legitimate sphere of expression. In the public discourse, it was propagandized the cult of women's free marriage virginity. According to nationalist views, the main task of women was to produce children and, of course, send them to the war. During the war, women's sexuality acquired additional connotations. Female body functioned as a symbolic representation of the body of the nation and the territory of the motherland, which could be conquered and violated. The purity of women's body symbolized the purity and dignity of the nation and its male defenders. The protection of women's body from enemies was equated with the protection of integrity of bodies of the motherland. In this context, women's sexuality was seen as a matter of national interest. The only type of extramarital sexual behavior which was encouraged by nationalists was that we suited to the interests and tasks of the underground. Leadership of OUN and UPA attempt to use women's sexuality as a powerful resource in intelligence gathering. The training materials, here you see the quote from those training materials, state, women with ideological principles make love to foreigners to serve for the good of their nation as much as possible. And here you see, yes, men are silent and women have those two main qualities, attraction and cunning, and they should use these features. And here you see one of the member of intelligence service of OUN, Hanna Liskevich. This photo was taken 1 year ago when we conduct interview, and here you see the young Hanna with her parents, and she told me that it was not easy to perform those duties. It was not easy in the village to establish romantic sexual relations with German officers or Red Army officers. So for many young girls, such instructions could have been problematic, since they required the kind of behavior that ran counter their upbringing and moral and ethical norms of the time. And those instructions undermines their social standing. And many men, locals and women, locals, who were not aware of spy games between Ukraine underground movement and NKVD, they could blame those women for stand out with Bolsheviks, with Moskals. Yes, and we know that those in Ukraine underground movement we have obvious double sexual standards, and here you see the list of sexualized violence against women by fellow men practiced by Ukraine nationalists underground, sexual harassment, rape, sexual assault, tortures during interrogation, kill of women suffering from venereal diseases, forced prostitution, and punishment for romantic sexual relations with enemy men. And here you see the quote. The quote from the report of Ukraine Red Cross about the girls who were arrested during Chekist military operation in one of the region in Lviv Oblast, and most of those girls were infected with sexual transmission diseases after interrogation. And it was really common at that time of heavy military operations against Ukrainian nationalists on the ground performed by Soviets, and many girls were ill after that. But it was instruction to avoid killing those women, because in UPA there was a very strong problem with venereal diseases, and the most popular treatment, let's say, was killing those men and women, because they haven't enough medicine, they haven't enough doctors. So, but despite of those instructions, for example, Wanda Horczynska told me that she's former OUN member, told me that her fellow Tetya was infected on the Afghan raid during Soviet counterinsurgency in the Ternopil region, and then she was killed by a security service of OUN. But when we talk about dual sexual standards, it's obvious that those double standards were applied differently to both and to men and women when we talk about sexual collaboration, romantic relations with enemy. And here you see one of the OUN leaflet, 10 important pieces of advice for Ukrainian girls. And we have indication, do not choose a foreigner, it means not Ukraine, ethnic Ukraine, as bridegroom, because you will never be able to be happy with him. And marry only a nationally conscious, solid and honest Ukraine, and you will be happy with him. And here you see some pictures of men and women. They were both members of Ukrainian nationals on the ground, and you see that bride have this vyshivanka, it's Ukrainian traditional clothes. And here you see, for example, the wedding in the underground and marriage certificate with code names of those who attend. Let's say a couple words about who were enemy men from point of view of Ukrainian nationalists. First, belong to the hostile minorities, Jews, Poles, Russians, representatives of Nazi, Soviet and Polish regimes and their collaborators, for example, members of Komsomol, Communist parties and Communist Party and so on, military men, of course military men, German armed forces and so on and so on, political opponents among Ukrainians. As you know, Ukrainian nationalists were switched between two wings, Melikiti and Banderitsi, and they fight with each other. And enemy men were also those who opposed the idea of the creation of independent Ukrainian state and criticized OUN ideology and methods. For example, here you see leaflets of OUN and the instruction of the security service of OUN, and they indicated who are enemies of Ukrainian people, all communists regardless of their nationality, Poles who cooperate with Germans, policemen regardless of their nationality, in spite that many policemen were members of OUN, Ukrainians who work with our enemies, act against UPA, and so on and so on. And here you see very popular ways to punish women for horizontal collaboration, let's say. Stigmatization, exile from the village, material damage, cutting and shaving hair, beaten with sticks, and executions of women or their relatives. We haven't such pictures in Ukraine case, but we have a lot of different documents. For example, here you see one NKVD report about shaving hair of 3 Ukrainian girls in one of the city in Volyn Oblast. Here you see the quote, of course it's a picture not from Ukraine, but it's very good to illustrate for this quote from report. In the village, in one village we cut hair of three women, in other village we cut hair of 2 girls, and so on and so on. Here you see the quote from Solomia Venner. She lives nowadays in Ternobyl, and she told me that on the eve of the village, it calls in Ukraine praznik, yes, it's the church holiday, and on the eve of this church holiday, there were punished 6 girls in her native village. So it's obvious that nationalists choose days for punishment which were very vivid, very important to local communities, because it was connected with, with established social order and with gaining support from locals. Physical punishment. For example, you see here testimony, thank you very much, from Maria Poch. There were 2 girls who should stand with Germans, and for that they were given 20 spanks each. And here you see testimony from village of Skulen in Kovylo region in Volhynia, and the list of women who were punished because of their sexual romantic relations with Red Army officers and Red Army soldiers. And it's a very vivid example, because we see that were punished not only those single, let's say, women, and not those who were engaged in women activities, but also sisters and wives of members of UN and UPA. And here's a very vivid example. Richka was a member of UPA. Richka compromised the organization, means OUN, with absolutely immoral personal behavior, having immoral lover relations even with an NKVD officer. So law was not excused. You will be punished in different cases. And also close relatives of girls were punished. I mean, their mothers and fathers. Malvina was hanged. She was told, take your daughter away from this MGB man. Yes, and also I want to, the last point, women who were married with enemy men were perceived also as enemy and were killed. And here you see Likvidacyjna lista, the list of those who were killed by security service of UN in one of the region of Lviv Oblast. And this list contained mostly names of men, enemy men. But, and we always have an indication for what. But in front of names of women, she was a wife of man, and so on and so on. And I jumped to conclusions, I'm sorry. So, violence against women depended on official position of the local leadership, the position of a woman in a given locality, priority of activities, network support, I could explain it later. The level of women's engagement in the OUN. I mean that most of OUN members were killed because hair shaving for them it was not appropriate from the point of view of OUN leadership, because it was obvious that they are traitors. So they want to hide these facts. And gender-based violence was used to preserve patriarchal power and traditional gender regime as a tool of the social control, as instrument to achieve the political goals, and to construct power relations among the nationalist men as well as their relation with enemy men. And I maybe will explain this later, because yeah, it's interesting. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for your vivid paper on the not very heroic gendered background of Ukrainian resistance. Now, our third paper. The speaker is Justina Smalkite. She graduated from Vilnius University, where she got her BA, and she holds a double master's degree in European history from Paris Diderot University and Humboldt University of Berlin. Currently, she is a first-year PhD student at the Center of History at Sciences Po in Paris and is preparing a dissertation on gender and inter-ethnic relations within anti-Nazi resistance movements in German-occupied Lithuania.
Thank you so much for this presentation. First of all, thank you so much for having me in this conference. The conference paper that I'm presenting today emanates from my PhD research. In my PhD thesis, I aim to examine multiple anti-Nazi resistance movements in German-occupied Lithuania from the perspective that combines the categories of gender and ethnicity. I am glad to present my research in this conference while being still at the very first stage of my doctoral research, actually. So today I will be talking about the history of the formation of the local force, also known as Vietinė rinktinė in Lithuanian and Litauische Sonderverbände in German. The local force was a very short-lived military unit of Lithuanian volunteer men formed by the Germans in February 1944 in order to fight the approaching Red Army and the anti-Nazi partisans within the territory of the Generalbezirk Litauen. For the reasons of simplicity, I will further refer to this territory as the German-occupied Lithuania, even if it's not exactly accurate. In April 1944, the local force had a peak strength of about 10,000 men who were assigned to 14 battalions. Some battalions were employed in anti-partisan operations in Vilnius region, but the largest Polish and Soviet partisan units operated. In May 1944, the local force engaged in armed confrontations with Polish partisans and committed atrocities against Polish civilians. Just after 4 months of its existence, the organization was disbanded by the Germans on the 15th of May, after the Polish soldiers of Armia Krajowa defeated the local force near Murowa na Ośmianka village. High-ranked members of the local force were deported to the concentration camps, the Nazi concentration camps, while a part of ordinary members formed the anti-Soviet armed units in the Lithuanian forest that fought the Soviet regime from 1940s to the early 1950s. Despite its short existence, the history of the local force received a quite substantial historical treatment. Its history has been mostly treated in very large sentences about ethnic conflicts or so-called civil wars in the Eastern European borderlands during the Second World War. Other historians tend to focus on Lithuanian collaboration with the Nazis and interpret anti-Polish and anti-Bolshevik attacks by the local force within this kind of two-dimensional framework of collaboration versus resistance narratives. Of course, to put it clearly, the history of the local force is a part of the larger history of Lithuanian wartime collaboration with the Nazis. However, the success of the mobilization to the local force was really very impressive compared with the other mobilization attempts in German-occupied Lithuania, especially to the failed Nazi attempt to mobilize Lithuanian men to the Lithuanian SS Legion in spring 1943. The success of this last mobilization has been explained by a branch of post-1990 Lithuanian historians as motivated by the willingness of the voluntary men to defend their country against the brutality of Polish and pro-Soviet partisans, and of course the approaching Red Army. Seeing the local force soldiers as genuine Lithuanian patriots, these historians often fail to elaborate more balanced accounts that would also include discussions of anti-Polish violent attacks committed by the local force soldiers. Moreover, such historical accounts often fail to insert anti-Polish violence by the local force in a larger framework of increasing violence against non-Jewish civilians during the last month of the German rule in Lithuania. So, in this presentation, I would like to suggest slightly different reading of the activities of the local force. Firstly, I suggest that this violence, this anti-Polish violence, should not be dissociated from the Lithuanian nationalist project, defended by pro-war right-wing Lithuanian politicians and army generals. To assert the dominance of ethnic Lithuanians in the multi-ethnic territories of Vilnius region, as I will try to show in this presentation, was also central to the generals of the local force. Secondly, I will discuss the formation of the local force from a perspective that combines the categories of gender and nationalism. That is to say, I will discuss it as an attempt to remasculate the Lithuanian man and to re-Lithuanize the country. And my presentation is based on official documents of the local force generals. It's like reports, orders, etc. German and Lithuanian police reports, anti-Nazi Wharton press, reports of the Army Krajowa and Pusko, members of local force soldiers. By pointing out some cases of violent attacks against politically or ethnically defined, allegedly hostile civilian populations committed by different pro-Nazi and anti-Nazi groups, one can see how interethnic violence escalated during the last month of the German rule in Lithuania. The first large-scale non-Jewish civilian massacre was carried out by the Red Partisans in January 1944 in Kaniuki village. Kaniuki inhabitants were accused of collaboration with the occupational regime. And 38 people, mainly of Polish and Belarusian ethnic origins, were killed. The largest scale civilian massacres were carried out in June 1944, almost a month before the retreat of the German army. Glitishkas massacre carried out by the Lithuanian police resulted in 27 deaths of Polish civilians. This massacre was followed by the one in Dubingi, where around 20 Lithuanian civilians were killed by Polish underground fighters. Also in June, 119 people were killed in Pirčiupiai village. It was the largest German punitive action against allegedly pro-Soviet civilians in Lithuania. When it comes to the anti-Polish attacks by the local force soldiers, several reports of Army Krajowa confirm that the local force soldiers attacked civilians of Polish origin in several locations. In these reports, the number of victims is almost never specified. By 1944, we can see that a vicious cycle of violence became a permanent component of life in the Lithuanian countryside. And this dynamics of multi-directional interactive violence during the last month of the Nazi rule in Lithuania could be read from several perspectives. For example, Tomas Balkelis, who wrote extensively on the interethnic violence during the First World War and its aftermath, claims that the Lithuanian political project, and that is even to say the very notion of independent Lithuania, was born during the war, so was a fruit of the war. And I would like to suggest that in 1944 the political conjuncture was rather different. Nevertheless, the link between violence and nationalist imagination was really central. To be clear, I do not mean to suggest that the leaders of the local force explicitly encouraged anti-Polish violence. Actually, it was rather the opposite. Local force leader General Plechavičius forbade any form of ethnically based violence and ordered to protect all civilians of Vilnius region, no matter which language they spoke. For example, the Order of Plechavichus issued on the 26th of April condemns the soldiers who, I quote, treat unkindly or even brutally Polish citizens, end of quote. Perceived as provocators acting against peaceful Lithuanization process, the soldiers responsible for carrying out anti-Polish attacks according to this order were to be severely punished. Despite the severe condemnation of anti-Polish violence, Plechavichus' order clearly demonstrates that the local force soldiers were encouraged to participate in the Lithuanization campaign in Vilnius region. Local force commanders imagined actually this Lithuanization process as a long and demanding labor that should not be done in a too aggressive way. So, and actually this reasoning was totally in tune with the dominant right-wing Lithuanian nationalist imagination of the late 1930s. And the late 1930s were marked by state authoritarianism. The authoritarian Smetona regime established after a coup d'etat in 1926 employed aggressive anti-Polish rhetoric on every occasion. The creation of the Lithuanian nation-state was perceived to be incomplete unless its historical capital, Vilnius, was to be retaken from Poland. And some historians even argue that anti-Polishness was the very central symbol of the newly defined Lithuanian national identity of the interwar period. In the late 1920s and 1930s, the authoritarian regime defended a state model which conceived nationality in terms of ethnic belonging. Actually, even the 1926 coup d'etat was largely justified by the contemporaries as an attempt to save the country from the left-wing radicals and Jewish and Polish minorities. And one of the reasons of the coup d'etat was the perception of independence for veterans that the core nationality, the Lithuanians, began to lose their legitimate dominance over other ethnic groups. Such perception was reinforced by a newly formed left-wing coalition in 1926 that, unlike any previous government, included numerous Polish and Jewish politicians. And here it comes again General Plechavichus, who later became the leader of the local force. And he was one of the leading figures of the coup d'etat. As many other highly respected generals of the Lithuanian army, Plechavichus felt anxious about leftists and Jews allegedly gaining more and more power in the newly established Lithuanian state. Plechavichus' hostility to ethnic minorities and left-wing ideologies is well documented. It is, however, much more complicated to examine the motivation of ordinary soldiers of the local force. Why did they volunteer in masses in 1944? And why did they attack civilians of Polish origin, even if such acts were formally forbidden and even punished? And of course, it's not an easy question. And because of the lack of testimonies of ordinary soldiers, it is rather difficult to have a detailed view of soldiers' motivations. However, there are some indications. Firstly, the previously discussed large-scale anti-Polish campaigns in Lithuanian interwar press and strong state anti-Polish attitudes indicate that for the new generation of patriotically minded Lithuanian men, actually this anti-Polishness became a commonplace. By 1944, during the period of increasing violence against civilians, such cognitive categories based on ethnicity served to simplify a highly complex world and to design the enemy populations. Furthermore, the Soviet-German war detonated the brewing ethnic unmixing of people that resulted in the use of violence as the most effective homogenizing tool in the disputed territories in southeastern Lithuania. But however, this is also only a part of the story. Because if we approach the history of the local force formation from a gender-sensitive perspective, we can also see that this Lithuanization campaign also had a goal to remasculate Lithuanian soldiers. On June 15 in 1940, Lithuania unconditionally accepted the Soviet ultimatum and lost its independence. President Smetona escaped to the West together with other anti-communist politicians. the Red Army entered Lithuania without any resistance. The story of the failed resistance to the Red Army has been endlessly evoked in wartime Lithuanian nationalist press. This defeat was perceived as especially shameful to the Lithuanian army, and this traumatism of June 1940 resulted in a symbolic emasculation of Lithuanian soldiers because of their alleged incapability to defend their country against foreign aggressor. Plechavičius and other generals really exploited endlessly the memory of the Lithuanian defeat to the Red Army for the sake of mobilization to the local force. Firstly, Plechavičius' appeal to join the local force was issued on the Lithuanian Independence Day, the 16th of February in 1944. It evoked several important national moments that patriotically minded young Lithuanian men could easily understand, and therefore to interpret this mobilization as a decisive moment to fight against the approaching Red Army and the enemies within the country. Mobilization appeal was issued on the radio by Plechavičius himself, who was by then a very highly respected veteran of the independence wars. The memories of the First World War was also an important element. Many Lithuanians tended to imagine the outcomes of the Second World War as somehow replicating the story of the Great War, when after several wars with neighboring countries, Lithuania succeeded in establishing an independent state. In his radio statement, Plechavičius urged young men to defend their homeland. Perhaps the most significantly, he promised that this Lithuanian detachment, unlike famous Lithuanian police battalions, will never be employed outside the country. For the volunteers of the local force, their message was clear. Participation in this military enterprise was a Lithuanian affair and not a German one. I believe that they could easily see a continuity between the political project of the local force, even if it was never clearly articulated, and the authoritarian state regime of the 30s. It was also clear that Plechavičius invited Lithuanian men to bring back the honor to the Lithuanian army, which was often blamed for the lack of resistance to the Red Army in 1940. In addition to this, it was not uncommon for Plechavičius to evoke alleged or real atrocities committed by the Red partisans. In a statement issued 2 days after the first appeal, Plechavičius encouraged Lithuanian men to join the local force in order to defend their country against barbaric Bolsheviks who, quote, kill our brothers, rape our women, steal and burn our property, end of quote. It is a rather classic nationalist view on militarized man and the masculinized humiliation and masculinized hope. As it has been argued by Cynthia and Lowe in her heartbreaking analysis on gender and nationalism, men were perceived as the only legitimate political and military actors who are defending their freedom, their honor, their homeland, and also their women. From this statement, we can also see that Plechavičius, as many other Lithuanian right-wing politicians and army generals, employed clear distinctions between our women and their women. That is to say, women from other ethnic origins. There are also a few reports concerning sexual assaults of non-Lithuanian women by the local force soldiers. In one of them, the generals were complaining that the Lithuanian soldiers were harassing people of non-Lithuanian ethnic origins, and especially Polish women. To sum up, in this presentation I tried to read the formation of the local force as an attempt to revolutionize the country and to remasculate Lithuanian soldiers and to prepare to fill the power vacuum after the retreat of the Wehrmacht. And in order to achieve it, ethnically based violence was occasionally used as an effective homogenizing tool by the local force soldiers. Thank you.
The inner logic of the Lithuanian local force. So we had 3 thought-provoking contributions, and I think you have a lot of comments ask whatever. The floor is open.
I have two questions. The first one goes to the Norwegian case. I mean, we've heard about already this morning about that long democratic and civil tradition of the Norwegian society. And now it's quite typical for those democratic societies that there's a clear gap between privacy on one hand and the public sphere on the other one. And obviously, directly after World War II, this gap disappeared. It was fading away. The exclusion of children is something, as you showed us, for me, it came close to racism. Close to it. Yeah? Do you have some evidence that perhaps this was a direct or indirect result of the Nazi occupation and the Nazi racism which was put into the Norwegian society? And the second question goes to Ukrainian women. I mean, I find it also quite interesting to hear that. But to sum up your main thesis at the end, you said that the violence against women was motivated by, what was it? Power relations, gender regimes, social control, and so on and so on. There was not much said about the nation. And here my question is, would you go so far to say that the perpetrators used the nation only as a pretext, pretending that they are defending the nations, but they were defending something completely different?
Thank you for a very interesting panel and a lot of new information, but some of which I couldn't absorb completely, so I'd like clarification, especially about Lebensborn and exactly what that means. If you wouldn't mind, and Nazi experts will know this, I just don't. I mean, is this the Norwegian women that are going someplace, having sex with German men, and then they go home and they say, I don't want the baby? Is that correct? Or could you explain exactly what's happening? And then you say, I think you said there were 12,000 children born altogether, and 8,000 of them were Lebensborn. And were the 4,000 that were not Lebensborn treated any differently than those that were Lebensborn children? And I guess that was the basic, just the lack of information. And also some information from Marta, if I could. So this has to do with, for me, something completely new. As I said to you at lunch, I didn't know that women on the Eastern Front were shamed in that way, were punished in that way. And I wonder if you would speculate, or somebody would speculate, where does this come from? I mean, if it's happening in Denmark and in France and in Italy, and in godforsaken Ukraine, at that point, I mean, the Soviet Union is cut off from the rest of the world, right? I mean, in some of these places, how, do you consider this a local custom? Do you consider this a general European thing? Do people know about it? How does that work? And also, I wasn't quite clear. It's clear that OWN is doing this, to collaborators with the Soviets. Are Soviets doing it? To women collaborators with OWN, or women collaborators with the Germans? I mean, is this a general thing that everybody's doing on the Eastern Front? To women. In the case of Poles and Lithuanians, the question comes up, and again, there were things I didn't understand completely as part of the hearing, but having to do with the Polish goals in this region. I mean, what you have, obviously, and this is what summer '44 is, already the struggle for the post-war, right? I mean, what's happening probably in both cases, the Lithuanian case and in the Polish case, is an attempt to shape the post-war by, getting the Poles out of Vilnius if they can, or destroying Poles in Lithuanian territory. And on the other side, the Poles doing exactly the same thing to the Lithuanians, right? Because the AK is very interested in making sure that territory like Vilnius belongs to Poland after the war. They don't know it's not Poland. So, I mean, this is a real national struggle. You know, on the largest scale, in some ways, wouldn't you say so? That it's not just about kind of national or ethnic difference. It's more about, you know, the future of their own countries. And that brings me to a question, actually, I'm sorry to ask you questions, but they were really interesting papers about both the Polish-Lithuanian and the Ukrainian case, where it's quite clear, this goes to the conversation we had in the previous panel about national identification. So in the case of Poles and Lithuanians, you know, there's this famous, you know, case of, you know, Mickiewicz and all that, is a Polish, is a Lithuanian. And it's not just Mickiewicz, right? I mean, it's a whole, you know, the thousands, tens of thousands of people who don't think of themselves necessarily either as Poles or Lithuanians. I mean, how does that play out in this particular struggle? And the same thing could be said about Ukrainians in some parts of Ukraine in terms of their intermixing with Poles. I mean, they Ukrainianized Poles and they're Polonized Ukrainians, and they marry each other, and you don't know what the hell you are, right? So, you know, how does that play out a little bit in this, you know, in this question of home, you know, in its struggle against the Poles, which is quite clearly very powerful and a big part of civil war.
I think this is enough for the first round of questions. Everybody got some questions, so please.
Sure, I guess I'll jump in and address Bach's question about sort of like the racist element. I can't say that I've found sort of evidence of it, granted I haven't really been looking for. And is your question really sort of like this sort of racist sort of rhetoric, is that a result of the Germans' presence in Norway? If that's your question, I haven't found much evidence of it. Norway obviously had a pretty healthy interwar eugenics movement that had a lot of sort of academic conversations with the Germans, and so there were people who were already thinking kind of along those lines. I've certainly found sort of underground resistance members passing poems making fun of the Germans and really like lambasting their racial theory. So some people, actually maybe the people who have the most reason to dislike half-German children also kind of, at least nominally, didn't agree with these racial theories, but I think there's a certain just sort of understanding or playing into that already. I guess it has currency in the Norwegian culture, possibly through the interwar eugenics movement, and certainly the way that they're talking about Germans after the war sort of smacks of racism as well, that kind of rhetoric. So I don't know if that fully answers your question. I haven't found it, I guess, is the short answer. Should I jump into Lebensborn or no? And I apologize for not giving more background on it. I just kind of, I made assumptions about the audience. So, no, Lebensborn is really interesting, and there's all kinds of misconceptions floating around out there. Really got sort of popularized in really the sort of 70s and 80s, this breeding farm myth kind of things, that they were basically, you know, taking Aryan women or having sort of bordellos of Aryan women and then making, you know, SS soldiers come and sleep with them and get them pregnant kind of thing. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but Lebensborn really operated as sort of SS-run maternity homes and orphanages and like medical offices, all the kind of things you would need to get a child to term and born. But basically, they would these children would be conceived out of sort of more or less spontaneous relationships. I haven't found too many instances of rape, but obviously that's really underreported. But these are women, at least in the Norwegian case, who are getting pregnant by German soldiers stationed, you know, kind of in their own communities, sometimes even in their own houses. And they find themselves occasionally cast out of their parents' house, their local community, really with nowhere else to turn except to the Nazi authorities. And so there was a whole application process. They have to submit photos of themselves to prove that they are Aryan. If they even, you know, if their soldier had given them the correct name, they could provide his information as well. And the Nazis would check to make sure that, you know, the woman was physically Aryan and just sort of morally upright, that she was not a prostitute, and then also had no sort of problematic political leanings. A woman could get a leg up into Lebensborn, for example, if she had a brother who was in the Hitler Youth or a father who was in the Nationalsamling. So, so it's not really orphanages. There were orphanages for the women who didn't want to keep the child, but the mothers did have the option to do that. I believe they made it mandatory at one point the woman had to be seeking marriage to the German, had to sort of prove her willingness to move to Norway, or to Germany rather. I'm sorry, I'm like a bit jet lagged right now, so I'm not super coherent. But yes, so she would have medical and nutritional assistance to have this child, and then afterwards financial support from the Germans if she wanted to keep the child. If not, they would sort of take it off her hands, and then the ultimate goal would have been to send the children back to Germany.
She could keep the child if she wanted.
Yes, yeah. Even though it was often like a single parent kind of situation, which wasn't their ideal. And then sort of quickly in terms of, do I see a different treatment between the Lebensborn children specifically and the other war children? Not really in terms of their everyday life, which I find kind of odd because the Lebensborn was such an SS and highly Nazified institution that I haven't found. It's hard to get accounts though.
Okay. Thank you very much for interesting questions. Yes, I will put it on my conclusions because you are right. In many cases, it's about abuse of power. Because they want to just to take property of those women, especially when men were absent. Or in many cases, I found out that they punished women, and especially girls, young women, because they refused to have a romantic relation with nationalist men, for example. And they just punished them. Okay, I will spread the rumor that she is collaborated, that she sleeps with Soviets and so on. Another reason is to cover their own cooperation with Soviets, to hide, you know, their own cooperation. And the third reason could be show loyalty to their superiors. I talked with one man, and he said, yeah, I wanted to have a better position in this power hierarchy, and I choose this way to show that I'm true Ukrainian nationalist, you know. I just punish those girls. So yeah, regarding your question, origin, in the Bible, we have this information about hair, about femininity, and so on. So it comes from the Bible. But when we take a closer look to European tradition, let's say, yes, we have cutting off hair of women in Spanish Civil War. We have also in Germany in the demilitarization zone in 1923. We also have in Greece some cases, you know, and when we talk about Ukrainian tradition, Taras Shevchenko, one of the famous Ukrainian author, poet, yes, he wrote about pokrytki. It means those girls who lose premarital virginity. And in Ukrainian tradition, they cut the plate and they cover their head. So it was during war, though those patriarchal traditions were re-established because of this, you know, violence, the whole pictures, because of this anger, and because of, yeah. And I found cases in different regions on Western Ukraine, and in most cases, perpetrators were members of Ukrainian nationals on the ground. But also we have the cases where perpetrators are just locals. Also children took part in this, you know, shows, and they throw stones to those women, and they hang plate of those girls in the center of the village. And also, in compared to this, we have cases where cutting hair off was established as a punishment to women who, for example, spread communist propaganda, were actors in the theaters, Soviet theaters, were activists during Soviet elections, were members of komsomols, activists in kolkhozs, and so on. So it was just re-establishing European and Ukrainian tradition, let's say. And regarding your question about this Ukraine-Polish relations, we have different phases of this. When we talk about this period of extreme violence in Volhynia in 1933, we have a lot of cases of sexual and sexualized violence by both sides, by Ukrainian nationalists, by AK and other members of this mob violence. So, yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so of course in 1954 there was already the struggle for a post-war order in eastern European borderlands, and Vilnius region was a very important highly disputed territory between the Poles and the Lithuanians. And of course all the sides were fighting, the Army Krajova as well as the local force, as well as Lithuanian policemen, as well as pro-Soviet partisans, etc. And all of them committed atrocities against civilian populations. And this problem of Vilnius region was really very important also during the interwar years. And it seems sometimes when I consult the sources that everybody was like literally crazy about Vilnius. And for example, I really found a document from 1943 from Jewish partisans from the Vilnius ghetto who established a link with the Army Krajova soldiers, and Jewish partisans wanted to get some arms from the Polish guerrilla fighters. And one of the first questions that Polish partisan asked the Jewish fighters was like, what do you think about Vilnius? Can we cooperate with you? Are you on our side? And the Jewish partisans simply replied that it's not on our agenda, it's 1943, it's like not really the center of everything, but it seems that in both Army Krajova rhetorics and in the rhetorics of the Lithuanian nationalist press and Lithuanian nationalist resistance, the Vilnius question was absolutely central. There could be no agreement between the two countries without this question solved. Also, the question about identities. Yes, it's a very complex question as well, because we can see some fluidity in those identities between Poles and Lithuanians and also Belarusians in Vilnius region. And there's also a term that has been coined to design a part of this population, of this Vilnius region. And this term is Tetuishi. And Tetuishi means, in Polish, means the local people from here. So there were some people from this region that did not identify themselves with neither Belarusians, neither the Poles, neither the Lithuanians. They were just simply the inhabitants of the region. And both states, the Lithuanian state in the early 1920s, when Vilnius was still a part of Lithuania, attempted to re-Lithuanize the region, and we also saw several attempts of this re-Lithuanization of the region in 1940. And also, of course, the Polish Republic also attempted to colonize the region and also to kind of assert a clearly defined identity upon those tutation, those people without clear identities. So, and also there were some people, as Mickiewicz or Romer, etc., who identified themselves as Lithuanians, rather Lithuanians, but they spoke Polish, so they were also Poles, so it's like there was also this fluidity, that it was more like multiple identity, a complex multiple identity, and I would argue that in the case of Tutation, it was more like really a very local, rather weak identity.
Thank you very much. We have time for another round of questions. He tells us.
Some questions the first is, as far as the motivation of these ordinary soldiers of the special units, were there any material incentives gained from their participation there? I mean, if you are in a region, for example, in Athens region, when there was hunger, second, 3 or 4 bigger food rations were an incentive, were material incentives. And second, are there any elements of Nazi ideology detected in their public discourse at that time? Because later on, I guess they have said we're just Lithuanian patriots, but during their mobilization, public speeches in the local press, tracts, etc. Is this concept of international Jewish conspiracy and Jewish capitalism and Jewish Bolshevism together is detected in the discourse? By the way, locals is the self-identification today of the Macedonian Slavs in northern Greece, of all of them, independently of their national proclivities, Dobki or Tukashman. Even if we are 30 generations away from the population resettlement of the area, with Greeks from Turkey. Now for Mrs. Kavishko, the first question is, you had this oath or forceful undertaking of terrorist activities by some women of own. Is this maybe this considered a voluntary act? I mean, I have in mind oath taking in both the revolution, later on, Macedonian organizations. That is when somebody enters the organization, undertakes under punishment, etc. If I disobey, you can kill me. In the Macedonian revolution, they were giving the oath over a dagger and a pistol, saying, with this you shall do. Is this such a procedure, or is this something different? The second is, can you meet, because you deal with gender issues, meet any autobiographical text of somebody describing the perpetration of rape by himself, not by others, not our people came in, or as a denunciation, but describing what he did. And the third one is l'identità lista of own liquidations. Is this a Soviet or an own document? I mean, is the Soviets writing down who was killed by own and the reasons, or it's a paper of own itself saying we killed those people for this reason?
Henrik,
thank you. Two short questions on Lebensborn and Norway to you, Caroline. First of all, was there any public debate on the idea to deport children in Norway? I mean, in Denmark, with a lot more lenient treatment of women that fraternized with Germans and children and so on. Already in the summer of 1945, I think there were voices from important personalities raised against the treatment of them. That was the one question. The other one is regarding Lebensborn and its influence on the treatment of these women and their children. surely you know of the Norwegian work by Terry Emberland and Matthew Koch on the SS and Norway and Hitler's ideas of Norway as an experiment for the SS and so on. I thought maybe there is a connection between this SSification of children and so on that might have influenced the way Norwegian resistance and authorities saw them as much more nazified than, for instance, was the case in Denmark, where Lebensborn never really brought it to anything.
I think this is enough. So everyone has questions.
Thank you a lot for this question. Okay, so yes, the local force soldiers had some privileges, some material privileges from the German occupational regime. Firstly, they got better food rations, and also, of course, they were armed by the Germans, obviously. And there was another thing that in case of death of local force soldiers, their families could be granted a financial aid. So this was also important. Regarding the Nazi rhetoric in the discourses of the local force, of course there were some, but there were also some neutral discourses, let's say Lithuanian nationalist discourses, and there was also a very long discussion between the German authorities and the Lithuanian authorities of the local force, because the Germans wanted the Lithuanian soldiers to take an oath to Hitler, and Lahajus refused to elaborate such oath, and there was a very, very complicated discussion between the Nazis and the Lithuanian nationalists. And also, it was also very interesting because the Nazi very racialized rhetorics were never used by the official propaganda of the Halich's local force. So instead of racialized ethnic hierarchy, they suggested protection of Vilnius inhabitants, no matter which language they spoke, etc.
Well, thank you very much for interesting questions. First of all, let me start from rape and autobiographical accounts. Yes, we have. Yeah. In most cases, I found one diary when a very high-rank UPA officer described, we came to this territory, to this locality, and local women bring us, let's say, varenik and borscht to eat, yeah? And we had fun with them, you know? But in this case, it's obvious that those girls were raped by this group of UPA people, UPA members, because then he described that they asked them, begged them to let them go, you know? So it's obvious that we have the case of rape. But in other cases, when we have investigation of security service of ONU, for example, we have also the case of one of the high-rank commander of UPA, Poet, his code name was Poet. He arrested a very young and beautiful girl and accused her for cooperation with Soviet secret intelligence, falsificate this protocol of interrogation, and because during interrogation he raped her, and he falsificated this protocol in order to punish her by death. But she blamed him for this, and it was very long-term interrogation, and Poet write all details of this case, and so on and so on. And we have many many such evidence from own documents. It's not, yes, we have KGB files, yes, but you know, in Ukraine, for example, in Ukraine, during Ukraine conference, when you talk and refer to KGB files, oh, KGB files, it's not true, you know, but when you talk and show SB files, security service of own files, so it's obvious that this is, yeah. The question about terrorist attacks and female terrorists. The motivation was, we have very diverse motivations. And one of the very popular motivations where members of OUN were blamed for cooperation with Soviets, and for them искупить кровью. You know, please take the gun and go. It's choiceless choice, you know, the most cases. But also we have very, you know, very young girl indoctrinated by those ideas, you know, I want to die for Ukrainian, and in OUN report they indicate, oh, it's full young girl, you know, and you let go and shot this NKVD, and this girl was arrested by Soviets and sentenced to death. So it was not effective. But we also had the cases where women were actually NKVD agents, and they want to enter and to show loyalty to their own leaders, leaders. And she came with proposal, let's say, kill this NKVD officer, you know. And they said, okay, you can. So we have a diverse motivation in this regard, and yeah, but I'm currently working on an article on this question. It will be in English, so it will, yeah. So, and about documents, my study on gender-based violence committed by OUN and DUPA members, first of all, is based on own documents, because we have a lot of those documents, really a lot. But you know, and most of them are regarding SB activity, security service, because most of members of SB service, they were killers, you know, because they played a key role in those executions of people. And we have a lot of documents like liquidatina lista, like other reports, who was punished by death, by stakes, by cutting hair off, and so on. So a lot of documents. Other documents, a block of documents are KGB files, yes, and we have nowadays open access, fully access to all KGB files. After Revolution of Dignity, according to one of documentation law, KGB archives are really open in Ukraine. And the third big range of sources are mine sources collected with approximately 100 of female members of OUN and DUPA. And their stories, you know, it's really, they really, this is incredible stories, because most of scholars who work on OUN and DUPA history, they are men, and they are, let's say, they have very strong nationalist views, and they concentrate on, you know, this heroic narrative, on this military, you know, history, and so on and so on. And my point of view, my perspective, is more, let's say, human. I talk about everyday life, and gender is matter in this question, because I'm a woman. The sister of mine, my grandmother held a very high position in medical service of OUN, and I am Galician. I know all these words, and I explain them that we have nowadays in Ukraine this this fear to express those feelings, you know, and they could openly talk about their experience in Ukraine underground movement. But because you know that during Soviet time, they were silenced by official anti-nationalist narrative. They were called traitors of motherland and so on, bandits. But after gaining restoration of Ukraine independent state, we have this heroic narrative, you know, and nowadays they are silenced by this heroic narrative. They couldn't talk openly about Bandera or Shukhevich, you know, and about all crimes committed by UN and Nepal members. But I'm still working with those women, and yeah, sometimes they refuse to publish their memories, or I can talk off records, please, you know. And I indicated in my research that they refuse to, especially when it comes to stories about rape committed by well-known commanders of UN and Nepal. But we have those stories, yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, real quickly, Henrik, thank you for the excellent questions. Yes, there's definitely a public debate on whether or not you could just, you know, ship 9,000 kids off to Australia, or certainly sending, they might not have known so much about it, but trying to send them to Germany or the state that Germany's in at the time. You go through a lot of, you know, newspapers and looking at sort of op-eds, things like that. It seems like the people, I mean, certainly your average everyday, but a lot of the folks who are writing in tend to come from fields of, you know, social work, healthcare. Some leaders of the church also speak out, and the teachers as well. They were sort of central groups that pushed the resistance movement forward, sort of civil disobedience style. So their words may carry a fair amount of weight. But I'm still sorting through all that. But yes, absolutely, there's public debate. The SS-ification, I like that phrase, of the children and whether that influences their post-war treatment. It's tough. Norway really, this is going to sound terrible, it's kind of the only country, including Germany sort of, where Lebensborn is sort of successful. And similar would have defined it. I mean, at its height, Norway has 9 Lebensborn homes, which is as many as Germany has. And it produces roughly the same number of children in half the amount of time, and a population that's a fraction of the size. So it's really significant. Trying in my dissertation to really sort of grapple with why exactly, and there are serious geographic and structural reasons, obviously, and the Germans having such faith in Norwegian genetics also helps. I don't know if, you know, Norwegians turning women out of their local communities and homes is that much different than in other contexts, but I'd be interested to find out. One thing to note about Lebensborn in Norway is that it was always operating for women pregnant by SS officers, right, because they already had to prove their Aryan heritage, but for Wehrmacht soldiers as well. They constituted the bulk of the occupation force. So as long as the Wehrmacht member, or Wehrmacht father, could prove his sort of Aryan status, then it was okay. I don't know if that accounts for some of the slippage, whereas in Germany, at least initially and for most of its operation, Lebensborn was just for wives and girlfriends of SS members. So yeah, so I don't know, despite the sort of political component of the application that these women had to fill out, it seems like their motivation really lies in sort of some mix of maybe desperation or opportunism or something else, and very few of them really conceived of their actions as political. You know, having a Nazi child, even if they might have to claim so on their form. So I can't detect much difference, again, as I said, in the treatment of like war children versus Lebensborn children. But maybe that's because folks assumed that, you know, any woman pregnant by a German soldier would turn to Lebensborn for those material resources if she thought she could qualify. I really don't know. It's so hard to get at anything to do with their mothers, really, because they were so silent for most of their lives.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody. I think this panel has shown how productive and how important it is to look at collaboration and resistance with a gendered perspective, and that you cannot do it without it completely. Thank you very much. Before you leave to the coffee break, 2 organizational remarks. The cloakroom on the first floor will close at 6 o'clock. So if you have deposited coats or bags or whatever there, please pick them up before 6 o'clock. And for the keynote lecture, we meet here in this room at 6:30. Professor Mayhawk's keynote lecture. And now we have a coffee.